Thank you so much for coming. The inspiration for my novel, Incognito, came from a story I was told about someone committing an unforgivable act. I wanted to explore how that act affected both the victim and the perpetrator, and how each of them found peace. Incognito is set in New York City and Long Island in 1911, the Gilded Age. The main character, William Dysart, is an aristocratic young lawyer. William is asked to negotiate the purchase of a small piece of property adjoining the 2,000-acre Long Island estate of Lydia Billings. Lydia Billings is the widow of a Wall Street financier and is leaving her property to the state in his name. Lydia claims she needs the property for a plan she has for the Henry Billings Memorial Park, as she envisions it, claiming the property has incredible views across the Long Island Sound, for which he is planning a rustic pavilion. William at first believes this to be an irritating accommodation to a powerful client. However, after a number of encounters with Sybil Curtis, the young woman who owns the property, he soon realizes that more is at stake than a few acres of land. As William persists in trying to understand what that might be, the mystery surrounding Sybil Curtis's identity deepens. I'm going to read a short excerpt from chapters 5 and 7. Chapter 5 opens with William meeting in the office of the senior partner at his firm, Philip Havering. William has approached Sybil Curtis with incredible offers for her property, which she has rejected. Chapter 5. During his meeting with Philip Havering the next morning, after being pressed repeatedly about his failure to convince Miss Curtis to sell, William finally said in exasperation, "Miss Curtis seems to think, no, is convinced that Lydia Billings has some personal reason for wanting her property." "Been living by herself too long," Havering snapped. "She's probably a bit off." "She seemed perfectly sane to me," said William. Havering frowned and drummed his fingers on the gleaming surface of his mahogany desk. "We tried repeatedly to settle," he said finally. "We were prepared to make an extremely generous offer on behalf of our client, and she wouldn't even consider it. If there is a problem at some future date, that will all be in our favor." It had all been a charade, thought William. Havering and Lydia Billings had known all along Mrs. Curtis was not going to sell her property, and they knew why, too. Now, if Miss Curtis managed to raise a fuss, which was doubtful, William would make a credible witness to her obstinacy, and his discretion could be relied upon in view of the long-standing ties between William's father's family and Lydia's family, a relationship that Havering, and no doubt Lydia, assumed William would take great pains to protect. William returned to his office angry at being used as a pawn in some bizarre game. He wondered for a moment if Miss Curtis might not be a love child of Henry Billings. Probably just a poor relation, he thought, as he made a quick note in the file he had started for the case, marking it closed. He then took a walk outside to clear his head. When he returned from his walk, he found a message from Havering on his desk. "Lydia Billings wants to see you. She's not happy," Havering had scrawled on his monogrammed stationery. "Damn it," William whispered as he pushed down the phone lever several times to put through a call to Lydia. Her private secretary answered and canceled a previous engagement so that William could meet with Lydia at her home on East 54th Street at 2:30 that afternoon. As William put down the receiver, he thought of Sybil Curtis's suggestion that he ask Lydia why she was so determined to have Sybil's property, and he decided he would do just that. It had been some time since William had last seen Lydia Billings, who had been considered quite a beauty in her youth. He was surprised when she entered her drawing room to see that age had given a sharper line to her chin and greater prominence to her nose, imparting a certain severity to her face. "William," she held out her hand as her maid closed the door. "Thank you for coming by today. I hope I'm not taking you away from anything too important." "Nothing more important than this, Lydia," he took her hand. How kind of you to say so. Would you like a drink? No, thank you. So, William, she sat down across from him on a delicate sofa bolstered in yellow silk. How can we solve this little problem of ours? Frankly, I don't know. As you are aware, I have spoken to the owner twice now, and she is not willing to sell, whatever the price. Your only recourse, as I believe you have already discussed with Mr. Havering, is to have the property condemned. I really would like to avoid any unpleasantness. She toyed with the amethyst ring on her finger. Such a bore. She laid her hand against the smooth yellow fabric of the sofa and studied the deep purple of her ring against the bright silk. I can wait till late spring if that will help. Perhaps by then you might find a way to convince the owner to sell. The owner, Miss Curtis, is aware that it's you who wants to buy her property. Lydia sighed. These things have a way of getting around, don't they, Lydia? And my impression is that she has some personal reason for not wanting to sell to you in particular. A lot of people have something against me simply because my name is Billings. She clasped her hands together. But there is nothing I can do about that, is there? Perhaps. But Miss Curtis seems to think you have something against her. How ridiculous. She made a sweeping gesture. I don't even know who she is. She leaned forward. What could I possibly have against her? She said I should ask you. How extraordinary, she laughed. It seems the moment people hear the Billings name, they go mad. You know, of course, Mr. Billings was responsible for the Civil War, the Johnstown flood, and the blizzard of '88, I should remind her. She shook her head. So I have some ulterior motive for wanting this woman's property. Well, I would like very much to hear it. But you can tell her that she had better be willing to repeat it, whatever it is, in court. William waited a moment. Lydia, he said finally, since the owner is determined not to sell, whatever the reason, and you wish to avoid a struggle which could bring negative publicity, what about an alternative site for your pavilion? Have you considered that rise of land not far from your dock? William, Lydia cut in. It is not for me to consider alternatives. Now, this Miss Curtis can either accept my offer or the States later, and you may assure her that the States will not be nearly so satisfactory as mine. Now, she has until the end of May to be off the property. How this is accomplished, I don't care, but it will be accomplished. I see, said William. Oh, I do so hate to be harsh. Her large gray eyes, which had a keenness undimmed by age, burrowed into him. Now I'm sure you think me a perfect monster. She said, her voice suddenly smooth, her smile almost flirtatious. Not at all. Well, it is kind of you to say so. You must realize how important this is, not only to me, but to all those who will enjoy the park for generations. You will try one last time, William, please? William nodded, and as their conversation continued, he felt that each word he spoke was false. His every smile a small lie. When he stood to leave, William could see that Lydia was pleased. Certain he would make a useful tool in her attempt to wrest Sybil Curtis's property from her without any negative publicity. He glanced around her drawing room with its soaring arched windows, Flemish and Italian paintings, and silk on walls, and it oppressed him as no wanton display of poverty or ignorance could. He said goodbye to Lydia, and her butler showed him out. As he made his way home up Fifth Avenue, his black leather shoes scuffing against the pavement, a sense of apprehension began to grow in him that this battle over a small piece of property on Long Island might somehow, before it was over, cause him to forfeit either his self-respect or the slow, steady rhythm of his uneventful life, and he was desperate to lose neither. Chapter 5. Monday morning, as William was working, a return wire arrived from Sybil Curtis confirming their meeting on Wednesday. He was surprised she had agreed to meet him. How many times had she to tell him she would not sell? But perhaps she realized he was being pressed to it by Lydia Billings and took pity on him. 2 days later, they sat across from one another in her comfortable front room, the long shadows of the November afternoon falling across the floor. Sybil smiled at him. Mrs. Billings doesn't understand the meaning of the word no, does she, Mr. Dysart? I don't suppose she hears it often. You know her well, said William. Well enough. She says she doesn't know who you are. Sybil shrugged. If you think you're going to have your day in court with Mrs. Billings, or embarrass her in some way, there is not a chance in the world of that. The condemnation proceedings will all be executed with such brutal precision, you'll hardly know what's happened until you're on the street somewhere. Do I seem so very naive, she asked. Just young and idealistic. I might say the same of you. William looked at her a moment. I merely expect people to act in their own best interest. Perhaps I am acting in my own best interest. Not from where I sit, William sighed. I must say I admire your fortitude. You're certainly going to need it. He reached for his coffee cup and took a sip. Miss Curtis, before I go, I have one last question for you. She looked at him. What exactly is it that George Eliot helps you to believe? She laughed. I'm flattered you have given such thought to my little remark. I'm not sure what I meant exactly. My father used to say that everyone is sacred. I think it's important to believe that. Why? Because if it's not true, nothing else matters. Maybe nothing does, said William. She nodded. Sometimes I believe that too. William set down his coffee. Do you see Mrs. Billings as sacred? Sybil reached for the coffee pot and refilled his cup, then leaned back in her chair and looked out the window. William followed her gaze to the fields of brown grass and the naked branches of trees in the distance, an otherwise somber view made majestic by the slanting golden light. Is there anything more beautiful or sad than an autumn afternoon, she asked. And Lydia Billings, William repeated. She looked into his eyes. I suppose, yes, I do think she's sacred. She turned to glance out the window again. Though sometimes I forget. I just think she's holy hell. William laughed. She turned to him with a surprised smile, as if she'd just been told a bit of happy news. If I see her as sacred, she continued, if that's even the right word, then I'm able to have some compassion for her. And if I don't, I'm filled with hatred for her. On the one hand, I see God in her. On the other, I see the devil in us both. She flushed. I'm sure, Mr. Dysart, you're now thinking I've been out in the country too long. On the contrary, I was thinking perhaps I've been in the city too long. William sipped his coffee. I hope you will reconsider, Miss Curtis. Frankly, I don't like the idea of your being at the mercy of someone like Lydia Billings. Who is your client, Mr. Dysart? William looked down. Yes, of course. He stood and noticed a small set of binoculars. Keeping an eye out for Mrs. Billings, he asked. No, she smiled and spit. I'm taking up bird watching. She picked up the binoculars. A bit of an extravagance, but I got them second-hand. She reached for a library book, The Birds of Long Island, and leafed through it. Isn't this beautiful? She held the book up for William to see. The Blackburnian Warbler, William read. Underneath it, a drawing of a bird with a yellow face and a black mask around its eyes, a splash of red at its throat. Interesting. I've spent a good part of my life on Long Island and have never seen one.
Very carefully, she raised the binoculars to her eyes. They are very shy.
He looked at her with the binoculars held up to her eyes as she spoke.
What lovely lips, he thought.
Delicate, finely etched.
Besides, they're only here in the spring. She lowered the binoculars and looked at William.
Oh dear, she tried not to laugh. You look embarrassed for me. The dotty country spinster. William was charmed. He noticed another library book, Moby Dick, and picked it up. I just started it, she said. I know it's supposed to be his masterpiece, but I think you have to be in just the right mood for it, said William. Thank you for not saying it's because I'm a woman. And thank you for agreeing to see me yet again, Miss Curtis. He extended his hand. I'm sorry for taking so much of your time with this unpleasant business. Sybil shook his